Australia's story starts thousands of years ago, when Aboriginal peoples lived across the vast land. They built rich cultures, made art on rock walls, and passed down stories through generations. They knew every part of their country from the hot red center to the blue coasts. They lived in balance with nature and had their own laws and customs that helped them thrive. The first outsiders to see Australia were not Europeans, but sailors from Indonesia. These fishermen from Makassar came to northern Australia to collect sea cucumbers, starting around the 1700s. They traded with Aboriginal peoples and shared some of their culture. Some Aboriginal words came from these early meetings. In 1606, a Dutch ship captain named Willem Janszoon became the first known European to reach Australian shores. He landed on the western coast of Cape York Peninsula in what is now Queensland. Janszoon and his crew stayed for a short time, made some maps, and left. They thought the land was just another part of New Guinea. More Dutch sailors came after Janszoon. In 1616, Dirk Hartog found the west coast and left a metal plate on an island to mark his visit. Abel Tasman sailed in 1642 and found Tasmania, which was later named after him. He didn't know it was an island and thought it was part of the mainland. The Dutch called the land New Holland, but didn't start any towns there. The first big change came when British Captain James Cook arrived in 1770. He sailed all along the east coast in his ship, the Endeavour. Cook claimed the land for Britain and named it New South Wales. He wrote about the good harbors he found and the strange animals he saw, like kangaroos. When Cook met Aboriginal peoples, there were both peaceful talks and fights. The British government decided to use Australia as a place to send prisoners after they lost their American colonies. In 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip led the first fleet of 11 ships filled with convicts and soldiers to Sydney Cove. They started the first European settlement on January 26th, which later became Australia Day. This day means different things to different people. Some celebrate it, while others see it as the start of hard times for Aboriginal peoples. When the British settlers arrived, they didn't understand that Aboriginal peoples already owned the land in their own way. The settlers started building farms and towns without asking. They brought new sicknesses that made many Aboriginal people very ill. As more settlers came, they took more land, and there were many fights over territory. The settlers didn't know how to live in Australia's harsh environment at first. They nearly ran out of food many times. Aboriginal peoples could have taught them about native plants and animals, but most settlers didn't ask for help. Instead, they tried to farm like they did in England, which often didn't work well in Australian soil. More free settlers started coming to Australia in the early 1800s. They wanted to start farms and find gold. The number of Europeans grew quickly, while the number of Aboriginal peoples got smaller because of fighting, disease, and losing their hunting grounds. The settlers pushed inland, looking for good farming land and new places to raise sheep. Explorers like Matthew Flinders went around the whole continent by ship and proved it was an island. Others like Charles Sturt and Ludwig Leichhardt went inland to map the country. These trips were very hard. Many explorers got lost or died in the hot, dry middle of Australia. Burke and Wills led one famous trip in 186061 that ended badly when they ran out of food and water. In some places, Aboriginal peoples helped explorers find water and safe paths through the land. But many explorers ignored Aboriginal knowledge and got into trouble because of this. The explorers' maps helped more settlers move into new areas, which led to more conflicts with Aboriginal peoples who lived there. The gold rushes of the 1850s brought huge changes to Australia. People came from all over the world to look for gold, especially in Victoria and New South Wales. Towns grew quickly, and railways were built. The mix of different people changed how Australian society looked and worked. Scientists also came to study Australia's unique plants and animals. They found creatures like platypus and eucalyptus trees that were very different from anything in Europe. But they often ignored Aboriginal people's deep knowledge of these plants and animals, knowledge that had been built up over thousands of years. The British way of using land was very different from Aboriginal people's ways. The settlers put up fences and said they owned specific pieces of land. This didn't match with Aboriginal people's belief that the land owned them, not the other way around. These different ideas about land caused many problems that still affect Australia today. As settlements grew, The government made laws that were very hard on Aboriginal peoples. They weren't allowed to go to many places they had always lived. Their children were often taken away to live with white families. These actions hurt Aboriginal communities and families deeply, and the effects are still felt now. Some settlers tried to learn from Aboriginal peoples and write down their languages and stories. But most ignored Aboriginal knowledge and traditions. They thought European ways were better, which meant a lot of Aboriginal culture and wisdom was not recorded or respected. By 1900, when Australia became one country instead of separate colonies, the relationship between Aboriginal peoples and settlers was already very complicated. Aboriginal peoples had lost most of their lands and many of their traditional ways of life. But they kept their identity and culture alive, even when it was very hard to do so. Looking back at these early meetings between Aboriginal peoples and Europeans shows us how different ways of living and thinking about land can clash. It also shows how important it is to listen to and respect other people's knowledge and rights. The story of these first contacts still affects how people in Australia live and think today. The hunters and explorers who came after the first settlement kept pushing into new areas. Major Thomas Mitchell led several trips into the inland parts of New South Wales and Victoria in the 1830s. He was one of the few explorers who paid attention to Aboriginal people's knowledge of the land. He wrote down some of their words for places and things, which helped save parts of their languages. The settlers who followed these explorers started big sheep farms called stations. These stations needed a lot of land, which meant taking more territory from Aboriginal peoples. Some Aboriginal people worked on these stations as stockmen and housekeepers, but they were usually paid very little or just given food and clothes. In Western Australia, the settlement pattern was different. The Swan River colony, now Perth, was started in 1829 by free settlers, not convicts. But they had many of the same problems as the eastern settlements: conflicts over land, cultural misunderstandings, and disease affecting Aboriginal peoples. The northern parts of Australia were settled last. The town of Darwin was started in 1869. The tropical climate made it hard for Europeans to live there, but Aboriginal peoples had managed well in these conditions for thousands of years. Their knowledge could have helped the settlers, but again, most settlers didn't ask. Through all these changes, Aboriginal peoples tried to keep their cultures alive. They kept telling their stories, teaching their languages to their children, and passing on their knowledge of the land. Even when this became illegal in some places, they found ways to maintain their traditions. Today we can learn a lot by looking at how these first meetings between peoples shaped Australia. Both good and bad things happened, and understanding this history helps us make better choices for the future. It shows why it's important to listen to different voices and respect different ways of knowing and living. The meetings between Aboriginal peoples and settlers changed a lot over the years. At first, some meetings were friendly, as both sides tried to understand each other. Captain Phillip, who led the first fleet, tried to be nice to Aboriginal peoples at Sydney Cove. He wanted to learn their language and understand their ways. But these good feelings didn't last long. As more ships brought more settlers, the peaceful times ended. The settlers wanted to build houses and farms on land where Aboriginal peoples hunted and gathered food. This led to fights over food and water. The settlers had guns, while Aboriginal peoples had spears and boomerangs. This difference in weapons meant the fights were very one-sided. The settlers didn't understand how Aboriginal peoples used the land. Aboriginal peoples moved around with the seasons, following food sources and taking care of different areas at different times. But settlers thought this meant the land wasn't being used properly. They believed that building fences and farming was the only right way to use land. Disease caused big problems too. The settlers brought sicknesses like smallpox, measles, and flu that Aboriginal peoples had never seen before. Their bodies didn't know how to fight these new sicknesses. Whole communities got sick, and many people died. This made it harder for Aboriginal peoples to protect their land and keep their traditions going. Some Aboriginal peoples fought back against the settlers in clever ways. They would burn settlers' crops or take their sheep. Some brave leaders like Pemulwuy in Sydney and Yagan in Perth led their people in fighting against the settlers. These men became famous for standing up for their people's rights, but both were killed by settlers in the end. The settlers also brought new animals that caused problems. Sheep and cattle ate the native plants that Aboriginal peoples used for food. Rabbits and foxes killed small animals that Aboriginal peoples hunted. These changes made it harder for Aboriginal peoples to live in their traditional ways. The government made things worse by making unfair laws. They said Aboriginal peoples couldn't go to certain places or hunt in their traditional areas. They weren't allowed to speak their languages in public or practice their ceremonies. Many were forced to live on missions or reserves, where they had to follow European ways of living. One of the saddest parts of this history was the taking of children from their families. The government thought Aboriginal children would be better off living with white families or in special homes. These children became known as the stolen generations. They weren't allowed to see their families or learn about their culture. This caused a lot of sadness that still affects people today. Despite all these hard times, Aboriginal peoples found ways to keep their culture alive. They told their stories in secret and taught their children when no one was watching. They kept their connections to special places even when they couldn't go there. They remembered their ancestors and their traditions. The settlers spread across Australia in different ways. In Tasmania, the settlement was very harsh. Almost all the Aboriginal peoples there were killed or died from disease. On the mainland, some Aboriginal peoples moved to areas where settlers hadn't reached yet, but eventually settlers came to most places. The gold rushes brought new challenges. Suddenly, thousands of people from many different countries came to Australia. They dug up land looking for gold, often destroying important Aboriginal sites. The new towns that grew up around goldfields took over more Aboriginal land. Some settlers did try to help Aboriginal peoples. Christian missionaries sometimes protected Aboriginal peoples from violence, but they also tried to change Aboriginal peoples' beliefs and ways of living. Some settlers wrote down Aboriginal words and stories, which helped save some knowledge that might have been lost. In the north of Australia, Aboriginal peoples had more time to get ready for settlers coming. They had already met people from other places, like the Makassar traders. This meant they knew more about dealing with outsiders. But when settlers did come to the north, many of the same bad things happened there too. The different groups of Aboriginal peoples handled the settlers in different ways. Some tried to be friendly and work with the settlers. Others fought hard to protect their land. Many moved between these two ways of dealing with settlers, depending on what worked best at the time. The settlers also behaved differently in different places. Some tried to be fair and make deals with Aboriginal peoples. Others were very cruel and didn't care about Aboriginal people's rights at all. But even the settlers who tried to be fair still took Aboriginal people's land and changed their ways of life. Scientists who came to Australia were very interested in Aboriginal people's tools and weapons. They collected many things and sent them to museums in Europe. But they often didn't try to understand the stories and knowledge that went with these objects. This meant a lot of important information was lost. The police played a big part in controlling Aboriginal peoples. They made Aboriginal peoples stay in certain areas and follow European laws. Some police were cruel and hurt Aboriginal peoples. Others tried to protect Aboriginal peoples from angry settlers, but they still made them follow rules that weren't fair. As towns grew bigger, more Aboriginal peoples had to change how they lived. Some found work on farms or in towns, but they were usually paid less than white workers. Many weren't allowed to live in towns and had to camp outside. They weren't allowed in many shops or hotels. The settlers brought their own plants and animals to Australia. They cut down trees to make farms and let their animals eat the native plants. This changed the land in ways that made it harder for native animals to live there. These changes also made it harder for Aboriginal peoples to find their traditional foods. Some Aboriginal peoples became very good at working with cattle and sheep. They became excellent stockmen and helped run big cattle stations. Their skills with horses and their knowledge of the land made them very valuable workers. But they still weren't treated fairly or paid properly for their work. The ways that Aboriginal peoples and settlers saw nature were very different. Aboriginal peoples had laws about looking after the land and only taking what they needed. Settlers wanted to change the land to make it more like Europe. They didn't understand that Aboriginal people's ways of using the land had kept it healthy for thousands of years. By the late 1800s, most of Australia's land was controlled by settlers. Aboriginal peoples were pushed to the edges of society, living on missions, reserves, or in poor parts of towns. But they didn't give up their connection to their culture and land, even when things were very hard. The way history was written during this time usually told only the settlers' side of the story. Books and newspapers talked about brave explorers and empty land, but didn't mention the Aboriginal peoples who helped these explorers or the communities who already lived on the land. This one-sided telling of history lasted for many years. When Australia became one country in 1901, Aboriginal peoples weren't counted as citizens. They couldn't vote in elections or get the same help from the government that other Australians got. This wasn't fair, but it took many years before these laws were changed. The early 1900s were hard times for Aboriginal peoples. Many had to live on special reserves where the government controlled every part of their lives. They needed permission to marry, work, or travel. Their children had to go to special schools where they weren't allowed to learn about their own culture. During both World Wars, many Aboriginal men wanted to fight for Australia. Some were accepted into the army, where they were treated more fairly than at home. But when they came back from war, they faced the same unfair treatment as before. They couldn't even go into returned servicemen's clubs like other soldiers. Things started to change slowly after World War II. More Australians began to think the treatment of Aboriginal peoples wasn't right. Aboriginal peoples themselves started speaking up more loudly about their rights. They formed groups to fight for better treatment and to protect their culture. In 1967, a very important vote was held. Australians voted to change the rules so Aboriginal peoples would be counted as citizens and the government would make laws to help them. This vote showed that many Australians wanted things to be fairer. The 1970s brought more changes. Aboriginal people started getting their land back in some places. They opened their own schools and medical centers. They began teaching their languages and culture openly again. More Aboriginal people became doctors, teachers, and leaders in their communities. Scientists and historians also started to learn more about how long Aboriginal peoples had lived in Australia. They found proof that Aboriginal peoples had been there for at least 65,000 years. This made everyone realize how much knowledge and history Aboriginal peoples had about the land. Looking back at the first meetings between Aboriginal peoples and Europeans helps us understand why some problems still exist today. The different ideas about land ownership, the loss of traditional lands, and the breaking up of families still affect many Aboriginal peoples. But there are good changes too. More people now want to learn about Aboriginal culture and history. Schools teach about both sides of Australia's past, not just the settler stories. Aboriginal art, music, and stories are shared and celebrated across the country. Aboriginal peoples today keep their old knowledge alive while living in modern ways. They use computers and phones but still pass down traditional stories. They work in offices and shops but still care for their special places. They show how old and new ways of living can work together. Many young Aboriginal people are proud of their heritage and want to learn about their culture. They talk to older people to learn traditional stories and skills. They use new ways to share their culture, like making movies or using social media to teach their languages. Scientists now work with Aboriginal peoples to learn from their knowledge. Aboriginal peoples know about plants that can be used as medicine, ways to look after the land, and how to track changes in nature. This knowledge helps everyone understand Australia better. The story of contact between Aboriginal peoples and Europeans in Australia shows what can happen when different cultures meet and one group has more power than the other. It teaches us why it's important to listen to all sides of a story and to treat all people fairly. Today, many Australians think it's important to say sorry for the bad things that happened to Aboriginal peoples in the past. In 2008, the Australian government said sorry to the stolen generations. This was an important step in helping people understand the past and work toward a better future. There are still problems to fix. Many Aboriginal peoples don't have the same chances in life as other Australians. They often don't live as long, don't get as good an education, and find it harder to get jobs. People are working to fix these problems, but it takes time. The early meetings between Aboriginal peoples and Europeans changed Australia forever. Understanding this history helps people today make better choices about how to live together fairly. It shows why it's important to respect different cultures and listen to different voices. The story of these first contacts isn't finished. Aboriginal peoples keep working to protect their culture and get back their traditional lands. They want to make sure their children and grandchildren know their history and are proud of who they are. Each year, more Australians learn about Aboriginal history and culture. They want to understand the true story of how Australia became what it is today. This helps everyone work together to make things better for the future. When we look at what happened when Aboriginal peoples first met Europeans, we learn important lessons. We learn that every culture has something valuable to teach us. We learn that treating people fairly is very important. And we learn that understanding the past helps us make a better future.